Welcome to Week 6, E-Learning Theories, Chapter 2 in your textbook. We want to talk about the learning process. We understand it is a psychological process because learning is something that happens when there's an internal change in the learner. So first of all, we want to talk about the theories of learning. There is conventional learning theory in the regular classrooms that we've had for many years, and then e-learning theory. And each of them have their own specific applications, but they also have some areas where they overlap. So we're going to talk about three foundations that are strongly associated with learning theory: transformation, framing, and emergence. And I included here a graphic called The Cone of Learning. It was put out by Edgar Dale back in 1969, but it's probably something that you have heard anecdotally in conversations that people will say, you know, if I can actually touch it or do it, or if it's something I can put my hands on, I remember it so much better than if it's something I just read or something that I hear. So this actually is a nice graphic to have because it reinforces what we already know. So the one theory of learning that we talk about is transformation, and as you can read here, it talks about what this is. Transformation, obviously, as the word implies, is some type of change in the learner's behavior. They say that it's the hallmark or the heart of learning. This theorist, Mezirow, I hope I said his name right, came up with this theory, and he said that he traced his concepts back to adult learning, especially for women in the learning communities that were instituted back in the 70s. And he says that mindsets are results of your cognitive, what you think, what you feel, and what your internal values are. These are the frameworks that play into learning. He said these frameworks will also affect your perception and your experience. Mezirow thought that learning is something that's an experience in order to guide your future actions. And he said there's two basic types of learning that we undergo. One is called instrumental learning, and that's a focus on learning through task-oriented problem solving and determining, what's the cause and effect of something. It's learning to do. That's another way to think about it. And it's based on things that you can see and analyze and discover. The other type of learning is called communicative learning, which is learning that involves the understanding the meaning of what others communicate concerning values, ideals, feelings, moral decisions, and concepts such as freedom, justice, love, labor, autonomy, democracy, these different things. So those are some types of learning that he specifically dealt with. Here are his 4 principles that he had. And actually, if you wanted to Google him and look him up, he actually has quite a bit of different things out there. But his 4 basic principles are here. He has actually a lot of phases of transformative learning and different things that he talks about. So what is the goal of this? The goal of this is that we want to have changes in our understanding along the personal, social, and political dimensions of the learner. And we want to make sure that the learning that happens is based on some type of effort or production from the learner. So it's more like engaged learning, it's more participatory learning, and that these efforts or productions are rhetorical and multimodal. So it's something that they say, something they feel and they touch. It's offered in many different ways. And the signs and semiotics that we use for these combine learning at a personal, social, and political levels. And I put the definition of semiotics in here because when I first read it, I myself thought, I know this word, but I'm not really sure what it means, but it is the study of the signs and the symbols as elements of communication behavior. It's the analysis of the systems of communication. So that's just a nice little tidbit to have. So first we talk about personal learning. When we think of personal learning, that's something that we know. We know the things we know, and it's hard for us to explain to others how sometimes we know what we know. It's something that sometimes you read or something that you have watched. In this day and age, you watch a YouTube video, you learn how to do something, but it's a personal learning experience. It's an individual feeling that you have learned something. Then you also have the social aspects of learning, and there are some prominent writers and theorists in this: Bandura, Brown and Adler, and Vygotsky. Now, Lev Vygotsky is one of my personal favorites. I believe that he has a lot of good theories about learning, but they talk about confluence. And, when you think of confluence, I think of an analogy of the rivers. They come together and they meet, and you have this confluence of different bodies of water that come together. But you see the graphic here that talks about these different aspects: your individual, your technological, and your social come together to provide a learning opportunity. So active engagement is a very important part of social learning. And as I said, Vygotsky came up with this thing called the zone of proximal development, which I think is very important. And it has to do with how much engagement you have with the learner while they're going through the learning process. And then we talk again about the semiotics that deal with learning, the icons, the visuals. What environment are you in when you're learning, and how does that environment contribute to the learning that takes place? Especially with e-learning, you think about it, as the educator, you don't have as much control over the environment that the learner is in. So how do you craft that environment to be something that's going to help the learner be productive when you don't have as much control over it? In the traditional classroom, you have the ultimate control. You arrange the seating in the room. You arrange how things transpire during the learning time. But especially with our type of learning, which is asynchronous here, I cannot have any control over when you decide to listen to the PowerPoints, when you do your work, when you actually read the book and have questions. And, that is beneficial for you as an adult learner, but sometimes it also comes with complications, because if you're reading and you have a question, there's not that immediate interaction to answer the question. So environment is a huge factor in how a person learns. And then they talk about other things. Are you in a group, an organization? Or are you on a community level of learning? They use this thing called spirals of knowledge. They're in organizations on the business side. When you talk about learning or training, there's a whole learning management process out there that they use, knowledge management, they call it. And they talk about what they call spirals of knowledge, which is when they get the synergies between the actual procedures that the company wants you to follow and how the learners internalize this and put those two things together to come up with learning. In the classrooms, in traditional classrooms, and even in this class that's asynchronous, we do a lot of pedagogical scaffolding. We try to start at a certain point and add on to that body of knowledge that the learner is taking. And we also know that learning is an effect of the communities that we operate in. There's also some political aspects of learning. Power, knowledge is a selection of possible outcomes. So sometimes when you're learning, there's this power dynamic out there that certain people have certain dominant points of view, or certain evidence or certain criteria is presented to the learner, and that power of that evidence or that power of those different points of view can color or affect the way the learning takes place. So framing is the last of the three aspects that we want to talk about. And framing is the way that we use the rule and experiences. These are called our interpretive frames. And those are things like the formal classroom. You know, in the formal classroom, there are certain expectations. Expected you will sit in your seat. You're expected to pay attention and only talk when asked a direct question or asked to carry on a conversation. You know, it's somewhat the expectation that the teacher or leader will be in the front of the classroom leading and guiding the discussion. But what we want to do with the framing is we want to take the frame of the meaning that the learner brings and the frame of the experience that the learner brings and put these together to come up with effective learning. So they talk in the book about what type of learning are you really doing? Is it explicit or is it tacit? And so I put some examples here or definitions here so you would know what's the difference between these types of knowledge. Explicit is the active process, and I put this graphic here. It says codified knowledge found in documents and databases. Explicit is when you take information and you seek out the structure of what they gave you. So when you have some explicit learning going on, it's when you're handed a paper, you're handed a text, you're reading through it, and you're going through it in a logical way. But tacit learning is that really intuitive kind of way of understanding things. Sometimes it can be unwritten, it can be unspoken, and it's difficult to transfer to another person when you try to write it down or verbalize it because it's something you internalize. It's something that you can understand based on your own internal frames of judgments, morals, past learning, these kind of things. So this is an interesting difference to know about learning. So we talk about what are the frames that we put around the pedagogy that we do in the classroom. So the biggest frame that we want is that we want to have some kind of change state for knowledge to take place. And so they talk about using the ABC type of scenario, and there is a graphic in the book that talks about this, and I believe that is on page 36. But what happens is you have stage A or state A, and A is when you're just there, you're the being, you are there, and you undergo some type of action or change in your knowledge. So that's B, that's the action that happens to you. And C is what happens after you were exposed to this type of change or knowledge. So I tried to think of a very simplistic explanation of this. So if you think about public education or higher education, it's pretty regimented in how you matriculate through this. You know, you don't go from 5th grade to 9th grade normally. Some people do. So if you think about this, I gave an example here of how A goes to kindergarten, he learns throughout the year, and at the end C is promoted, and this goes on. So that's how education, that's how the frames are for pedagogy in most of our institutes of education. On the business side, it's less formal, and it often includes what we call verbal or physical languages to do the education. Think about it when you go to the gym or you go to, you know, a local, you might even go to a nightclub on the weekends or go somewhere with your friends to have a good time. You know, if you're learning a new dance, that's a physical language while you're out with your friends. You go to the gym, you learn yoga, you learn a new routine. So these are different types of learning that you do. So I want to talk a little bit about Kegan's adult theory of learning frames and what he really thought. He was very much into this transformative type of learning. And he said that you have the self-transforming mind. Now, adult learning is called andragogy, and it's an actual study of just how adults learn differently than adolescents do. But How is this theory helpful in e-learning and education?